Hello Internet and welcome to Tromsø Twilight, the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you about books, movies and music that I find interesting. I'm starting to think I might drop the music from my intro because I've only talked about one album so far. And I've mostly been talking about movies, but today I want to talk about a book. That's because this book is a kind of cult classic and a book which I heard about for many, many years, and an author who I've seen referenced by many people, amongst others, Jamie Stewart from the band Shushu. And I've seen this author appear on a lot of lists of the most disturbing novel I've ever read, which is a video form that a lot of people on YouTube have done that I've often enjoyed. People talking about novels that they've, for various reasons, found disturbing, unsettling, and difficult. I'm hoping to do my own version of this list at some point, but I'm starting today with the novel Closer by Dennis Cooper. The premise of Closer is that it's about a boy, a teenager called George Miles, who is very troubled and very beautiful, and who is generally objectified by the men around him, men and boys, people his own age and people older. And as I understand it, I'm no expert about Dennis Cooper, but my understanding is that he really knew a boy called George Miles, that they were friends when George Miles was this age and Dennis Cooper was a couple of years older, and that Cooper had a kind of obsession with Miles and wrote 5 books in what's called the George Miles sequence or the George Miles series, of which Closer is the first. I read once on a blog or in an article Dennis Cooper referred to as a queer author who could not be assimilated into mainstream culture, and that's something that I've always found interesting. When I read the book, it kind of became easier to understand why he was described in this way. I should say at the jump that the themes of this book are very disturbing and, in some cases, deeply unpleasant. So, if you're not in the mood for that, please skip this video, watch some of my other videos, or wait for the next one. I'm going to do some more book videos, but they won't all be about very disturbing material. However, if you're interested in transgressive literature, if you're interested in hearing about a book that disturbed me, and I'm a person who reads a lot of quite transgressive material, then maybe this will be of interest to you. And if you've read the book, then I hope that you'll find my discussion at least a little bit interesting. All right, so to talk about form, Closer is written in the first person from different perspectives. All of the boys and men who have a sexual interest in one way or another with George Miles have different chapters in the book. There are also third person chapters which are about George Miles. So he's the only one that you don't have the interior perspective of. However, he also writes a diary, so you get some first person accounts from him. The book starts with a character called, I think it's John, let me just check. Um, John, who's a portrait artist. He's like very interested in punk, and he creates these kind of distorted portraits of people that look quite disturbing. I think they're in pencil or charcoal. And he doesn't really understand why he's doing this. He doesn't have any particular artistic agenda, but he really, really likes to draw and he likes to display his work. He's influenced by the punk movement, and he has this kind of nihilistic, dark attitude. I felt like Cooper was kind of talking about his own work in some way in this first chapter, talking about how he was going to create this distorted portrait of George Miles, somebody who he was using to explore his own obsessions, perversions, and interests. Um, John treats George quite cruelly. He draws him, he has sex with him, but then he tells him, sorry, I'm only interested in art. And George is obviously very disappointed. there's a clear through line in the book that George really is seeking something, some kind of contact, some kind of warmth, some kind of love or care in other people, but he just is repeatedly used, rejected, or actually hurt, either emotionally or physically, by the people who he seeks this contact with. When we come to his chapter, we discover that he has a mother who's very ill and a father who's emotionally absent. And even though he only appears to be, maybe, I'm not sure his exact age, but between 15 and 17, he's already taken acid on almost a daily basis. Um, so he's kind of walking through the world in this slightly altered state, very passive, at the same time as he has this cute and slightly angelic beauty that endears him to others. It's like he wanders into the lives of these other men who are exploring their sexualities and um, just passively gives himself over to them in the hope that something good will come of it, but if not, at least that it will um, make him feel less lonely or reduce his emotional pain. There's no getting away from the fact that this book contains some pretty disturbing material. It's probably the only book I've ever read that has repeated um, episodes of people eating feces in a sexual context. I believe it's called coprophilia. I think I've maybe read reference to it in other things. I know that it's something that's in some of the Marquis de Sade's work, but I don't like the Marquis de Sade. I've seen it in the film Sarlo, which was adapted from Marquis de Sade's work, but it's kind of presented in this book in a very matter of fact fashion, but also quite detailed in a way that makes me feel physically sick. It's one of the few books that's made me feel nauseous. There's a great deal of gay sex described in the book, but I would say it's not erotic. It's described in a way that is almost in horror of the body. It's like reminds me of Francis Bacon. I think that's probably the closest comparison. Writers it reminded me of were maybe the Marquis de Sade or William Burroughs in its kind of um, readiness to just go all the way. It has this very flat, nihilistic kind of style to a lot of the writing, but at the same time, it has a sort of poetic beauty that you don't find in other nihilistic writers, like, for example, Bret Easton Ellis or um, Chuck Palahniuk, however you say his name. At first, when I was reading this book, I found it maybe too much in that style, what I associate with a kind of 90s shock value, nihilistic type of literature that kind of puts in horrible or disturbing sequences kind of as an aesthetic device. But as this book goes on, it's a very short book, it's 190 pages, but in the second half, Miles falls into the orbit of a couple of guys who are quite interested in um, sexual killing and violence and narrowly escapes becoming the victim of these people. And at the point when Cooper got into this world of sexualized murder and snuff films, the book became genuinely horrific. Like it's a horror book, in my opinion, but it's about the horror of people's kind of empty objectification of each other and the horrors of an obsessive idea. So when Cooper got into this section of the book, I actually went from disliking it to being genuinely impressed by it because I thought there's a deep, deep seriousness about his exploration of the absolute darkest aspects of the human psyche. My other observation is that a lot of this book is about imagination and fantasy. George Miles is a kind of fantasy. He's a very kind of troubled but not especially interesting young man. But because of his beauty and because of his passivity, people project onto him their own fantasies, but then they consequently also become bored of him, which means that he's inevitably lonely. But the book explores fantasy in different ways. You have, the artist at the beginning. You have another character, I believe he's called David, who is almost outside of reality. He fantasizes so much about being a musician and a rock singer that he almost believes that he is. And then you have these guys who, have developed this fantasy of coprophilia or necrophilia or sexualized killing, who um, have kind of moved into this appalling twilight world because of their fantasies and their imagination. And all of this before the existence of the internet, before the dark web, and before all these things that we today think of as being these kind of terrifying online environments. Perhaps my favorite part of the book was the last chapter, which is about some kids who, um, this one kid has basically adapted his 2 room garage in his house into what he calls a nightclub, which is basically just a space where the local kids can come and party and play tapes and get drunk and take drugs. He's got like a little portaloo kind of toilet thing that he refers to as his office. And what I really liked about this chapter is that he describes it at the beginning as this kind of little makeshift thing attached to his parents' house. But then as the narrative goes on in this chapter, I started to imagine it as an actual nightclub, and I saw it as a nightclub in the way that these kids would have seen it as a nightclub, like the power of fantasy, the power of imagination transforming the space. And then right at the end, um, something terrible happens, and it's like it all returns back to the kind of unimpressive, slightly sleazy situation that it actually was. And this is what I think kind of happens again and again and again for George Miles. He sort of becomes this fantasy, but then the person loses interest, and the kind of sad, melancholy, lonely reality comes in. I don't know if I'll read another Dennis Cooper book. I'm glad to have read this one. I'm at a point in my life and in a situation in my life in regards to my work that I only have a certain capacity for material that is really kind of appalling. Um, and I guess that this kind of uh, transgressive, exploratory writing that Dennis Cooper was doing um, is sort of about exploring in art the absolute darkest recesses of the human consciousness. I work in psychotherapy, and I sometimes hear stories from people's lives that are very difficult and painful, and maybe my um, tolerance for that type of material in art is reduced as a consequence compared to when I was younger and I was maybe just more curious. But that's uh, that's my short kind of summary and short exploration of the themes of this book. Look out for a video from me at some point in the future, maybe 10 books that disturbed me or 10 books that I thought were disturbing. I've really, really enjoyed seeing those types of videos from other people. And I think I have some books that I could include that maybe a lot of people haven't heard of. Um, if I do read another Dennis Cooper, it might be The Sluts, because I heard that that's a really interesting novel. But have you read Dennis Cooper? Have you read Closer? What do you think about him? What do you think about his work? I'd love to hear from people who had similar experiences or who have very different perspectives. I really do think that this is a novel that um, can be read in a lot of different ways. So perhaps there's things I've missed, and if so, I'd love to hear from you. Okay, that's it from me for now. Trumps of Twilight. See you soon.